Today we'll be taking a look at the censorship made to the very first Resident Evil and its many re-releases over the years. Going by the name Biohazard in Japan, unlike the Western title of Resident Evil, Chris Kramer, Senior Director of Communications and Community at Capcom US, explains the name change was due to possible trouble with registering the original title, due to a recent DOS game that used the same name during its production. The rise in popularity of the hardcore band Biohazard probably contributed to this decision as well. While this name change is interesting, it's just about common knowledge at this point, so let's dig into the differences between the regions. For starters, there are a lot of them, and unlike the Biohazard name change, these are all direct results of pure censorship. We're going to begin with the original PS1 release, but keep in mind all the changes discussed here are also applicable to the corresponding regions of the Sega Saturn releases. Now, beginning with the first thing you'll see when you start the game, the intro was heavily edited when it was brought over to the West. The violence levels in the Japanese cutscene were originally comparable to that seen in an 80s gore-fest horror movie. But when this cutscene made the transition overseas, the more graphic aspects were cut out or replaced. For example, the images of the newspaper headlines were actually censoring graphic shots of bloody corpses. Further edits were made to the cast section due to Chris originally smoking a cigarette. This was replaced with random stock footage outside of Japan, although if you listen carefully, you'll still be able to hear the sound of his lighter just before a faint screaming sound. Here's the original version.
Chris Redfield.
And then here's the censored one. Remember to pay attention for the lighter sound.
Chris Redfield.
And the Japanese title, Chris also smokes in one other section of the game, this being the bad ending. Outside of Japan, this was replaced with close-up shots of his face. A further change was made to the cutscene shown when you encounter your very first zombie. This is a scene that still, to this day, creeps out many of the series' fans, although, did you know it was originally more graphic? Missing from the Western versions is the sight of Kenneth's decapitated head dropping to the floor and rolling on its side, allowing you to see its disfigured state. That's all for the edits in the original PlayStation and Saturn games, but there have been many more releases than this, and with more releases comes more censorship. But let's begin with the infamous case of the PS1 Director's Cut version. This updated release was created to help bridge the gap between Resident Evil 1 and the highly anticipated Resident Evil 2. It added a few new features into the mix and helped keep things fresh, but it also promised to be fully uncensored. It even says so right on the box. However, the game was exactly the same as the corresponding region's original version. Capcom later apologized and put the blame on some production mix-up, but this mix-up even affected the Japanese game. Yeah, that's right, the Japanese game was censored as well. It would be a while before this prohibited content will be released to the public for the first time, which is why it hasn't been mentioned yet, but let's get into that now. German and French players also had a nice little surprise waiting for them when they booted up the game, and this relates to the censorship made in Japan. Apparently, the mix-up was so mixed up that these two regions had their entire game censored the same as before, with the exception of the intro, which is presented uncut and in color, just like it was meant to be. Of course, the original Japanese version was uncut, but in black and white. The fact that Germany, of all places, who are well known for being one of the strictest in the world for game censorship, got the completely uncensored intro really makes the situation even more absurd. Despite Capcom's earlier apology, they, for whatever reason, chose not to rectify the matter in the slightest with the updated DualShock version. This release never made it to Europe, although, a slight warning, this version also made changes to the music, which caused a huge uproar with fans. To be fair, the new songs were produced by a composer who, up until recently, had pretended to be deaf as a way of making himself stand out. And yes, that is sadly 100% true. Let's move on to the numerous PC releases of the game. Now, it wasn't possible to track down every one of the vast amount of different PC copies out there, but it has been established that there exist both completely uncensored versions, including the color intro, and releases with the same censorship seen elsewhere. In the UK, for example, the Virgin Interactive version is censored and has a 15 BBFC rating, whereas the UK's Power VR edition is uncensored but with an 18 rating. To just rewind things back for a moment, now would be a good time to point out a strange anomaly seen in the Japanese commercial for the original PS1 game. During the advert, you'll see enemies let out green blood instead of the red substance used in the final build. The full details regarding this are at this point unknown, but it's likely that this is footage from a prototype version of the game. Also notice that Jill and Chris still let out red blood. Capcom would later revisit the idea of using green blood. You see, there's at least one PC version in existence that changes the blood to green. It's also worth noting that this would be seen again in the Nintendo DS Deadly Silence port. While this change isn't permanent, it does default to this in the option menu instead of red. It even affects the character's own blood, which makes things such as the famous Barry quote quite different. The default blood setting was applied across all versions, as was every other aspect of censorship in the DS game. The zombie cutscene would be made uncensored for the first time in English countries outside of the realm of PC gaming. However, despite not adding any new censorship, all of the other censored scenes remain, and this time even Japan couldn't escape censorship. At the time of the original releases, Japan was without a rating system. However, by this time, CERO, their equivalent of the ESRB, was in full effect, and as you may know, imposed a strict set of criteria, which has made Japan more and more prone to censorship as time has gone by. It's important to point out that the Japanese release was given an 18 rating, which is the CERO's highest, and thus it's likely this was not an attempt at widening their audience by reducing the age rating. The creation of CERO is the most likely explanation for an edit made late into the development of the Resident Evil Remake for the GameCube and then the later HD re-releases. In a Japanese trailer, a hunter enemy can be seen killing Chris by ripping his head clean off. This was how the hunters have always handled their prey worldwide, but despite being included in the trailer, the released versions simply leave our characters with a slit throat instead. As stated in the start, there have been a lot of changes over the years, as you can see, although that's still not everything. To finish, we'll cover a difference present in the earlier game's credit sequence. Whilst in most versions you'll see a fairly upbeat montage of various moments in the game combined with some fancy editing, in a few releases it is possible to fulfill requirements and change the credit sequence to something much less positive. The alternate version instead consists mainly of clips showing the character getting killed in a variety of ways, of course complete with lots of gore. An exact list detailing the versions that contain this feature has not been fully researched yet, but the very first Japanese game, as well as at least one US PC release, contains this feature. This is something that most players will likely have not seen before. So, to close, we'll leave you with the full scene to feast your eyes on. Enjoy! As always, thanks for watching. Censor Gaming is the definitive resource for censorship, so make sure you've subscribed to stay up to date with the latest censorship in games. Hey guys, I'm Jared from Avalanche Reviews, and if you're one of the Resident Evil faithful, feel free to come over to my channel and check out one of my videos covering the series. Or, Go your entire life without knowing vital facts about the industry's seminal horror franchise? Your choice.